Hello everybody and welcome to the Football Daily Podcast, a podcast in which we talk about football, not once, not twice, but we do it 7 times a week. Over the next 2 days we got 2 really good pods for you. We're talking fantasy football with one of our lead writers from UKEndZone.com, Neer Shah. He just put out some fantasy rankings yesterday. He's got a column up today. There's going to be more pieces from him and Neil Dutton, the fantasy team, to show you how to win your fantasy football league. They also do a podcast. They call it the MDDF, Mains and Dutton Discuss Football. That's Neil and his friend Paul Mannering, where they talk about betting and fantasy, and they're going to show you throughout the season how to win your league. But we thought on the daily podcast we'd roll a 2-parter with Neer. It's going to be about an hour, and we're going to tell you how to win your fantasy football league. So it's me and Neer today and tomorrow. Hope you enjoy. So joining me now is the second half of our fantasy football team. You always hear from one man called Neil Dutton. He hogs the fantasy limelight. But we have another writer who, in my opinion, I value his opinion even more than Neil's. That's a shot fired towards Dutton's, because this guy is going to help you win your league. It's Neer Shah. He's one of our lead writers for the fantasy football team. Neer, how's it going?
Oh, fantastic after that intro.
Yeah, you should be, man.
Really happy with that. Although, I'm not sure Neil's going to be too pleased to hear that.
I agree with you. You just put out your new latest rankings as of what? Yesterday, today?
Yeah.
And risers, fallers, things to help people win leagues. I mean, I just want to jump straight into it. We're going to treat this as a fantasy preview for the listeners of the podcast. And let's kick off with quarterbacks. Not really much movement in the top 5. I guess it's difficult to get movement in preseason with the elite quarterbacks.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, unless someone's really impressed in preseason, and let's be real, the top 5 quarterbacks, they're all, set in stone. They're going to be their franchise quarterbacks. So whether they show a little bit of rust in their preseason game or not, it's not going to affect, the vast majority of people's opinions of them.
No.
So
I only have a couple of things around the quarterback rankings and stuff. And first of all, when people read this, oh my God, when I get messages on my Twitter feed based on fantasy rankings on the site about Tom Brady, I want to just blow a gasket, because it's not like you're saying, hey, I think Cam Newton's upgraded over Tom Brady this week. Let's be real. Rushing yards mean a lot. We look at what Cam's done with that backfield. There's nothing in the backfield. They're all old. They're all going to get injured. He's going to have to run more, which means more fantasy points.
Totally agree with you there. I mean, Cam Newton, you look at his receiving core this year, and that's what the talk has been about in Carolina. Steve Smith has gone, Brandon LaFell's gone, Ted Ginn Jr. is gone. But think about it. Were they any good last year? I'd say no, they weren't. Sure, Cotchery, Jason Avant, they're not upgrades in the least bit. But Kelvin Benjamin's been tearing it up as far as anyone knows in preseason and in stretching back to OTAs. And I'll tell you what, guess what quarterback rank Cam Newton finished in fantasy football last year?
I mean, he's probably right up there with the 3 or 2 spot, because whenever I have Cam, I seem to win my league, so this is why I trust in Cam so much.
There you go. He finished 3rd overall, despite having an aging Steve Smith, Brandon LaFell, who cannot catch a cold, and Ted Ginn Jr., who caught the odd 40-yard bullet and did nothing else.
Another couple of things I have in the quarterbacks. This year is really interesting because Tony Romo has been like the fantasy darling. For people who are big fantasy players, you can sneak him later on because of his perception as as the 4th quarter losses and ESPN and these things, hyping how bad Tony Romo really is. When he's a good player. We all know this. If you're into football, he's at least he's a top 10 quarterback. I don't care what anyone says. And he just churns out yardage, and he has Des Bryant, and he's had Jason Witten. But you look at this year, Neer, do you trust him? Because that back injury, I think he's going to miss 3 or 4 games, because a bad back is severe as a quarterback.
Look, there's no doubt the injury plays into my rankings, which is kind of why I dropped him a spot this week, because he doesn't seem to be recovering too fast from that. Having said that, I'm on board with everything you said about Tony Romo being a top 10 quarterback. I've not understood this whole choking, moniker that's been put on him, because who puts them in that position to succeed? Sure, he throws the odd, late game interception, but he's got as many 4th quarter comeback wins than any other quarterback in the league. Now, coming back to this season, sure, his back is ailing him and his fantasy stock. But when you look at the defense in Dallas. They had the worst defense of the year last year, and I honestly think this year, without Sean Lee for the whole season,
That was.
they're gonna be challenging the Saints 2012 unit for the worst in history, I reckon. And what does a bad defense do in fantasy football other than help your quarterback out? I mean, they're going to be throwing early in games to, try and get back into the game. They're going to be involved in shootout after shootout. If Tony Romo misses 3-4 games through injury, I don't mind. I'll grab him. He's going to be the 9th, 10th quarterback taken off the board anyway. Mm-hmm. So the likelihood of, me drafting him comes with a caveat of having a backup, a decent backup like a Phillip Rivers, a Jay Cutler, Russell Wilson, And if I get one of those, I can just plug them in for the next 3-4 games while Romo's out injured. And, you're still putting up big numbers at quarterback.
And I look at his average draft position there. He's going 99th in the average draft positions, which is 29 after Colin Kaepernick. And you literally just leapfrogged Kaepernick above Romo this week. So you've got them essentially neck and neck week to week. I mean, you could snag a nice receiver and double back and get Romo over having Kaepernick.
Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, I'm not as high on Colin Kaepernick as most people are mainly because of the offense they run. Being very run heavy, but they're pretty much neck and neck for me. And I'm all about value. If you're getting Tony Romo 2 rounds later than Colin Kaepernick, mm-hmm. and I view them to be pretty similar fantasy quarterbacks, why wouldn't you get Tony Romo? Pick up a quality late round receiver, get a Golden Tate, mm-hmm. instead of a Riley Cooper that you would end up getting if you got Kaepernick instead of Romo. It's value.
The name that I always ponder about when I look at quarterbacks and think, God, he's always undervalued, even though he goes in like the first couple of rounds of he's drafting with people who are drafting not as fantasy nuts, because a lot of people now don't take quarterbacks there. But you've got Drew Brees at 3, which is obviously terrific. I would probably eke him just with Aaron Rodgers in terms of fantasy this year. You look at that offense, yes, it's not a great deal of weapons, Neer, you know this more than anyone, but they're going to launch the ball all over the place. That's what Sean's going to want to do. And they got these new young receivers. He's going to get them into a track meet, and they're going to get out and running. They've got a ton of guys who can get yards after the catch, which are a killer in fantasy leagues, because the quarterback who's efficient, who's elite, like Breeze, can just dump it off, and he's getting yards that really, the receiver earned.
Well, yeah, that all makes me really happy to hear, because I'm as big a Saints fan as you'll probably ever see. But the reason I've Breeze just a slight notch below Rodgers at the moment is because of the renewed emphasis on the Saints running game. I mean, you look at how they closed the season out last year. They finished their regular season against Carolina, against Tampa Bay, running the ball, putting up 30 plus carries, which you're not used to seeing New Orleans do. In the playoffs, they ran all over Philadelphia and picked up the win there. In their loss to Seattle, they ran the ball heavily. Heck, in the first preseason game that just passed, Mark Ingram, Kyrie Robinson, they were the talk of the town. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guarantee you that Breeze, if you draft Breeze, you are not going to regret it. And he's going to put up big numbers. But I don't know. I just think Aaron Rodgers, you got Jordy Nelson, you got Randall Cobb there, Eddie Lacy out of the backfield. I mean, he's going to be a bell cow at the back as well. But, talent-wise, I love Breeze, but Rodgers is just a better guy.
All right, let's look at the tight ends then. No real movement. Again, it's a position where it's difficult to get movement. You have the 2 elite guys. Is Gronkowski on your don't draft list? I want to get to a full look at guys who I think people should stay away from. Is it the year where, again, we stay away from Gronk simply because of injuries, or do we just say, look, the guy's elite. If someone's nabbed Graham, it's worth taking the shot on, Rob?
Look, this is a really, really unpopular thing for me to say, especially as a Saints fan, but on their day, if Gronkowski's healthy for 16 games, if Graham's healthy for 16 games, Gronkowski is a better tight end all round. I think he's as good as Graham as a receiving option, and, he's a million times better as a blocker. which means you can do so much more with Gronkowski on the field. The problem is, does he see the field often enough? And that's the question. If you read my last article, which I co-wrote with Ryan Conway, another fantastic writer at UKEndZone, we discussed injuries and whether Cutler can stay fully fit for 16 games. And Ryan asked me that question, and my answer was that I'm a believer that injuries can't be accurately projected. You can't project, that Rob Gronkowski's not going to be fit. It's one of those things. Unless you're Darren McFadden, it's hard to predict injuries. I would draft him. I'm definitely not going to put him in the do not draft pile. I will draft Gronkowski, and I'll just make sure that I'll pair him with a good backup like Charles Clay or Delaney Walker. Someone who can step in and, you won't miss that much of a beat at the position.
How many tight ends are really worth taking rather than just trying to overload on running backs or receivers, then seeing what free agency gives you after your draft?
Well, see, Gronkowski is one of the few tight ends that I actually target. And if I don't get him, I just wait. If I'm in a 10-team league, I'll be the 10th guy to pick a tight end. If I'm in a 12-team league, I'll be the 12th guy. There's just so much depth. I mean, there's not real depth at the tight end position in that you've got your top 5, your top 6, and then the position just falls off after that. As Neil quite often says, this is not the year for the tight end. However, if you're not going to be drafting you're not going to be drafting a top 5 tight end, then it doesn't matter whether you get this 8th best tight end or the 20th best tight end. Your guess is as good as mine as to who's going to be, better out of those couple of tight ends. And in that case, as I say, value. If you're going to get a similar tight end, in the 7th round as you are in the 13th round, I'd rather get it in the 13th round. I'll be perfectly happy if I end up with Zach Ertz and Dwayne Allen as, my pair of tight ends who I can play the matchups with. That's perfectly fine with me, as long as I've picked up another, interesting running back or wide receiver to stash away on my bench.
The first thing I jumped to, genuinely, when I read your piece and your rankings this week was the wide receiver, because I'm in such trouble right now with deciding where to go in terms of the wide receiver. How much do you put in with your rankings to the guy's got a good quarterback and he's got good weapons around him, so he's not the sole focus, as opposed to that's taking receptions off him? How does that factor into your rankings? Like Calvin Johnson now is going to see less of the ball because there's actually options around him, and we're expecting Stafford to try and spray the ball around a bit more, whereas Des Bryant, there's not much there for Des to work with.
Yeah, that definitely factors into my thinking. However, I guess it's not as much as other people's, in the sense that I still have Calvin Johnson as not my number one receiver, even though Golden Tate's now joining the mix. I still have Des Bryant second, even though Terrence Williams is, an up-and-coming star at the receiver spot opposite him. Yeah, I feel like if there's 2 quality weapons, at wideout positions in an offense, the likelihood is the rest of the offense isn't particularly great because of the salary cap era and the fact that you can't just have a star-studded offense. I mean, New Orleans, Denver notwithstanding. But that's how I approach it. If you've got 2 star wide receivers, I mean, Atlanta showed how to work that really with Roddy White, Julio Jones, and Tony Gonzalez, all 3 rather playing, and getting a lot of good production in 2011. I mean, 2012. Sorry. I mean, last year. Julio Jones was injured for the whole season. Roddy White had his injury woes, but by and large, I mean, they know who the stars of their offense are, and they just feed them. And I believe if there's a Golden Tate in the offense, Golden Tate will be served, but that doesn't mean Calvin Johnson won't be. It'll just mean that an iffy run game might get less carries in that offense, which is again why I've got Reggie Bush and Drake Bell slightly lower down, because if you add, Eric Ebron, you add Golden Tate to weapons such as Brandon Pettigrew and Calvin Johnson. It kind of figures that they'll throw the ball a little bit more this year.
Man, that team's going to be fun to watch. That Lions team's going to be super fun to watch. Who's the most undervalued wide receiver right now?
I'll go with Malcolm Floyd out of Arizona. I mean, he shares the field with Larry Fitzgerald, but as I just said, if you got two good weapons, you use them. And I don't think that just because Fitzgerald, is going to take a few targets, it's going to take the majority of targets, Michael Floyd will still put up a lot of numbers. I have him at wide receiver 17, which is slightly lower down from the wide receiver 15 spot I had him last week, which I'd say is higher than most people have him in their rankings. He's got the ability to be a very effective run blocker, which is really underrated for wide receivers because it means they'll see the field more often than not. Carson Palmer's getting better protection this year. I mean, in preseason, it's very easy to say, oh, this quarterback who didn't play very well last year is going to bounce back. Every team will be saying that about their quarterbacks, but I firmly believe that Arizona's quarterback, Carson Palmer, will actually improve because Bradley Sowell, I'm not sure how to say his name, but he's not going to be protecting that blind side. And that's, you'd hope not at least. And that's the major reason why I think Carson Palmer is going to improve. And if he improves, the wide receivers will improve. I mean, Arizona doesn't even utilize their tight end very often in their passing game. So, whoever's talking about Floyd not getting enough targets, I'm not too sure about that. I think he'll be a very respectable wide receiver option in fantasy football and might finish as a very high wide receiver too.
Yeah, and you've got him above Larry Fitzgerald, and he's a guy who springs out to me as not a do not draft, but I just feel like because of reputation, because of name, he's going to go higher than he should do. Him and Deshaun Jackson, I feel the same with, and I'm staying clear of Percy Harvin. I just don't trust the guy. Is there anyone outside of those three who you really are trying to stay away from, or just know they're going to get overdrafted, so you're going to wait and get the guy underneath them?
Well, you're not going to be too pleased with this, being a Patriots fan, but I am not a big fan of Julian Edelman this year in fantasy football.
There's not a single wide receiver that I have any akin to on the Patriots because they'll probably cut Edelman before I even get the chance to get the jersey. So you can criticize those guys all you want. That's
a good point. Well, Julian Edelman, he's ranked 49th on my list. 39th on my list, and it's because I feel like, much like what you said about Fitzgerald and Deshaun Jackson, where reputation precedes them, whoever's watched the Patriots play last year knew that Brady threw only to Edelman. There was no one else on that Patriots offense to throw to. So Edelman quietly racked up a lot of yards and receptions, as a starter in New England. However, with Amendola returning, Rob Gronkowski returning, I feel like those are already two major weapons for Brady to get back. And I just feel like Edelman just won't be able to get that many targets. In a PPR league, Edelman would be a lot higher than what I have him right now. But I don't know. I just feel like he's not going to be playing quite the role he did last year. And a lot of people will be drafting him pretty high, expecting that role.
Mm-hmm. You look at the guys you got in around him, I'd probably rather have Kelvin Benjamin. I'd rather have Anquan Bolden. I really would, because Brady's just going to hit it to the open guy. He doesn't really have a predetermined read. Vereen's going to be essentially now converted to just a slot wide receiver. Obviously, you got Gronk, you got Amendola, and if a guy can break man coverage, Brady's going to get him the ball. He's not just going to look to Edelman. And Edelman was the only guy who could get off man coverage last year, so that's why he found the ball. So I think it's a good shout.
Yeah, definitely agree. And you throw in a bit of progression by Campbell Thompkins and Aaron Dobson, and you can see why Edelman's not in my favor at the moment.
Running backs then, obviously the key position in fantasy football, they're all going to fly off the board in the first round. The first thing I have to say is Eddie Lacy is ranked way too high near. And secondly, Matt Forte. I feel like people are sleeping on Matt Forte. I know you've got him third, but in the overall sphere of the draft, I would take Forte number 1 overall. If I was on the clock this year, I'm taking him above AP, AD, whatever you want to call him. I'm taking him over Shady as well. I love Forte this year.
Well, first off, I'll address the Lacey hate.
There's no hate. I hate when people say that. You have an opinion, suddenly you hate the guy. What school did he go to, Nick? Can we clear this up? What school did he go to?
Alabama.
He went to the University of Alabama, so he's played pro football for 5 years. He played pro football, 4 years. He played pro football for 3 years in Alabama.
And that usage and workhorseness in college is going to catch up to him in 5 years' time.
Call up to Mark Ingram instantly.
Well, Mark Ingram was Mark Ingram. He's a different case entirely. I've not been too impressed with him in the last few seasons, but hopefully he'll pick up this year. Going back to Eddie Lacy though, I feel like he's in the perfect offense where if you think about last season with Peyton Manning and no Sean Moreno, Moreno, I don't like him very much, as you can see in my rankings. He's my 35th best running back. And yet he put up a monster season just because he was facing nickel coverage, dime coverage, pretty much every snap. Eddie Lacy's going to get much of the same thing, really. I mean, with Aaron Rodgers throwing to those weapons that he has on the outside, you'll see quite a lot of six-man boxers, and I think Eddie Lacy's going to take advantage. Going back to Forte, though, I think he's great this year. I mean, he's going to be a stud for whoever gets him. In pretty much every fantasy draft platform I've seen, Forte's projected to go 4th overall behind the established trio of McCoy, Charles, and Peterson. But I think me and Neil Dutton are of the same mind in that Forte deserves to go a little bit higher than that. First overall might be a bit of
He never comes off the field. He never comes off the field. He's like the only guy of those running backs who doesn't go off the field because he's the best pass blocker from the running back position in the league. And then you get all the dump-off passes from Cutler. We know he's going to be staring down the field to the two big guys on the outside. They won't always be open. He's going to dump it off. He's going to get a ton of garbage 3 or 4 yard receptions.
That's a good point, but I mean, Adrian Peterson doesn't leave the field either, for one thing. And you kind of brush on it a little bit in that Cutler has Martellus Bennett, he has Brandon Marshall, Alshon Jeffrey. I don't think he's going to be able to throw the ball enough. I mean, Forte will get his receptions, no doubt, but there is an upper limit of what Chicago can do on their offense, and I believe Forte, he's not in the same situation Peterson is, because Peterson, there's no other weapons in Minnesota apart from Cordero Patterson. You've got Greg Jennings, but I mean, if you're considering targets, the number of targets at the end of the season, who's going to have more? Will it be the duo of Marshall and Jeffrey, or will it be Patterson and Jennings? And you go back to tight end then. Do you think Bennett's going to catch less balls than Kyle Rudolph? Maybe, but not by enough. I just don't think there's enough to go around in terms of the Bears offense. But I still think he's pretty damn good.
All right, then we'll call part 1 to a close here. That's how to try and win your fantasy football league with me and Neer Shah. We're going to roll out part 2 tomorrow. I hope you come back then. We'll speak to you tomorrow.